On May 2, 1945, while the charred ruins of central Berlin were still smoldering, an encrypted signal intercepted by Allied listening posts in the South Atlantic raised a suspicion absent from official wartime summaries. It was not a message of capitulation nor a frantic plea from surrounded units. Instead, it was a brief transmission in German naval code originating near the Antarctic Circle. By that point, the Third Reich had collapsed as a functioning government, yet it persisted as a strategic puzzle. Although the Soviets confirmed Hitler's death, the world awaited the war's final conclusion. For senior American and Soviet commanders, however, the true struggle was only beginning. The final days of the Reich were marked by a chaotic evacuation of scientists, confidential materials, and specialized resources. Admiral Karl Dönitz, Hitler's appointed successor, issued vague directives hinting at continuing the fight from new strongholds, including cryptic references to a fortress of ice. Files from the Kriegsmarine later revealed that between February and April 1945, several Type XXI submarines equipped with advanced propulsion systems departed Norwegian ports on undisclosed missions. Post-war investigations confirmed that at least 2 resurfaced in Argentina months after Germany's defeat, their crews unwilling to disclose their routes. At the same time, the United States recognized that Germany's surrender did not end military rivalry, but launched a contest to seize the defeated nation's scientific expertise. This became Operation Paperclip, which secretly transported hundreds of engineers, physicists, and weapons specialists to American research institutions. The Soviet Union responded with its own capture program. The two powers emerged from the conflict not as partners against fascism, but as competitors on a widening global chessboard. Europe saw the war officially end. Yet certain Soviet dispatches warned of organized enemy withdrawals into uncharted regions. On May 11, 1945, Marshal Georgy Zhukov stated that some elements of the Nazi regime had not surrendered, only vanished. That same month, U.S. intelligence recorded a report from the Argentine embassy in Sweden describing covert talks between German representatives and South American governments to secure maritime passages into the South Atlantic. The name Nordbobinland began circulating within intelligence circles, though no one could determine whether it referred to a real territory, a hideout, or merely a coded phrase. The rise of the Antarctic legend was not accidental, but a product of rapidly deteriorating relations among the victors. Trust between the Allied powers dissolved within weeks. The Soviet Union pressed for dominance in Eastern Europe, while the United States prepared to assert control across the global seas. In June 1945, General Dwight D. Eisenhower declared that no region on Earth could be considered irrelevant in the new era. Suddenly, territories once considered strategically empty were evaluated for their potential military significance. In this context, Antarctica, long ignored due to its apparent uselessness, gained unexpected symbolic and geopolitical importance. Declassified British records show that as early as late 1944, intelligence officers noted German interest in geothermal anomalies detected beneath the polar ice. Admiral T. established crude observation stations on islands near the Antarctic Peninsula, under the cover of Operation Tabarin, officially described as a weather mission but internally linked to concerns about enemy activity. Germany's last hopes were not set on achieving a traditional military victory, but on preserving its scientific assets and relocating parts of its technological infrastructure to isolated regions. Hans Kammler, the SS official overseeing secret advanced weapons programs, vanished sometime between April and May 1945. His trail ended after departing Prague on an aircraft whose destination was never verified. U.S. intelligence considered him one of the Reich's most dangerous figures, yet neither his capture nor death was ever confirmed, fueling speculation that he had escaped to a remote southern refuge. Meanwhile, the U.S. Navy reported unusual movements of unidentified submarines across the Atlantic. Merchant vessels described underwater lights, encrypted signals, and brief appearances of metallic structures rising from the ocean before slipping away toward the south. Many of these incidents were immediately classified to avoid revealing that, despite victory, enemy vessels still possessed the means to evade Allied control. On July 14, 1945, President Harry S. Truman received a Navy memorandum warning of possible German activity below the 60th parallel and stressing the need to secure a strategic foothold before competing nations made claims. Admiral Richard E. Byrd, famous for his pre-war polar expeditions, was instructed to begin preparing assessments for large-scale Antarctic operations. The Soviets were conducting parallel inquiries. In August 1945, an NKVD report detailed intercepted conversations among former Nazi Party members hiding in Spain, discussing unreachable bases and southern escape routes. The report suggested Antarctica could serve as a temporary shelter for submarines and long-range aircraft, but the event that most intensified the mystery came in October 1945, when a German Type 9 submarine appeared near Mar del Plata, Argentina. U-530 surrendered without cargo, its navigation logs destroyed. Commander Otto Wermuth refused to disclose its path. 2 months later, U-977 arrived under nearly identical circumstances. The press speculated that these crews had unloaded personnel or documents somewhere before surrendering. For the first time, South American newspapers connected Antarctica to a secret German mission. Although the U.S. made no public statements, OSS agents interrogated the crews under the suspicion that elements of the Nazi leadership were still at large. The German Antarctic expedition, 1938-1939, on December 17, 1938. The MS Schwabenland quietly departed Hamburg. It carried no infantry or heavy weapons. Outwardly, it was a scientific vessel equipped with laboratories, observation decks, and 2 large catapults from which Dornier-Wall seaplanes could be launched to survey frozen, unexplored regions. The Third Reich's insignia gleamed on its bow, but the official paperwork submitted to the League of Nations referred only to meteorological studies, oceanographic research, and whaling investigations. However, a confidential memo from the Reich Ministry of Economics dated October 9, 1938, written by Hermann Göring, stated, "The true purpose of the expedition is to secure resources for German autarky and to establish territorial claims before other nations strengthen their presence." The expedition, under Captain Alfred Richer, was meticulously planned as part of Hitler's economic and geopolitical expansion strategy, particularly after Germany's break with Western powers and continued clandestine rearmament. By 1938, Germany relied heavily on imported animal fats from Norway for the production of margarine, soap, and essential chemicals. Food Minister Walther warned that if Britain blocked northern sea routes, the Reich would face severe shortages. Antarctica promised potential reserves of whaling-derived blubber and, more importantly, direct access to the polar continental shelf, whose subsoil was suspected to be rich in coal, rare minerals, and perhaps oil. Norway had declared possession over Queen Maud Land in 1930. The United Kingdom claimed South Georgia and the South Sandwich Islands. The Treaty of Svalbard of 1920 recognized certain exploitation rights to several countries. Germany was excluded. For Hitler, this was a strategic offense. The expedition had to correct this exclusion with a forceful act of presence. German newspapers portrayed it as a heroic voyage off discovery. The Felicia B. wrote, "The sons of the Reich will carry the banner off our new era to the last frontiers of the planet." What was not published was that the expedition was accompanied by SS Ahnenerbe geologists, experts in military glaciology, and technicians in long-range radio communications. The Schwabenland arrived in Antarctica in January 1939. Temperatures dropped to 15 below zero. The polar silence was absolute. The first Dornier-Wall flying boat, piloted by Richard Heinrich Schirmacher, was launched at dawn on the 19th of January. From the air, the crew observed what Norwegian maps had never recorded: vast expanses of ice-free terrain, open valleys and lakes that reflected sunlight like liquid mirrors in the middle of the white desert. Richard wrote in his diary, "It seemed like an impossible landscape. I couldn't believe that this existed on this continent. If the Reich is looking for a place to escape the limitations of the known world, this could be the last refuge." Over the next few weeks, seaplanes made more than 15 flights, dropping thousands of metal javelins with the swastika engraved on them, used to symbolically mark territory. In official reports, the name Noaban Land, New Swabia, was used for the first time in allusion to the German region, where the shipping company that had built the Schwaben land came from. Zeiss cameras captured more than 11,000 aerial images. In some of them, apparently geothermal areas were observed where the ice melted in circular shapes. There was talk of deep cracks that penetrated kilometers into the subsoil. A paper by geologist Ernst Hermann dated February 5, 1939 mentions, "It is possible that there are underground caves heated by volcanic activity. Formations were observed that could constitute protected natural entrances from the outside climate." Norway protested diplomatically upon learning of German activities. On February 14, 1939, the Norwegian government denounced that Germany was violating its pre-existing claims. The Reich replied that its expedition was scientific in nature and that the territory explored was outside the areas claimed by any state. The truth is that on February 12, one of the German flights had flown over coordinates on the Norwegian map, which led the Norwegian Foreign Minister Halden Koht to warn, "If this action has permanent purposes, it will be considered an act of territorial aggression." The German presence upset the international balance. The United States, while officially neutral, received direct reports from the naval attaché in Oslo, who noted that the German expedition appeared to have an undeclared strategic component. President Roosevelt summoned Richard E. Byrd, America's most decorated polar explorer, to evaluate the possibility of a rival expedition. Byrd replied that Antarctica was the last virgin territory whose control could determine future naval supremacy. It was the first time that US document mentioned Antarctica not as a scientific region, but as a potential strategic front. Meanwhile, on the Schwaben land, the crew conducted studies of ice thickness using seismic probes. The data revealed that in certain areas the ice was only 200 meters thick, well below the Antarctic average of 1,500 meters. This aroused speculation among the technicians of the Arna about the existence of a subglacial plateau suitable for underground installation. Richard requested permission to extend the mission, but received coded orders from Berlin. He was to complete the mapping and return before the end of February. Hitler was about to launch his invasion project of Poland, and did not want to commit resources on a still undetermined front. On February 3, 1939, Richard wrote the final report of the expedition. In it, he stated, "The Reich has established its presence on the Antarctic continent. I recommend a second mission immediately to consolidate our claim and evaluate possible permanent installations." But that second mission was never authorized. Just 7 months later, on September 1, 1939, Germany invaded Poland and started World War II. The Schwabenland was requisitioned by the Luftwaffe for logistical operations. The documents and photographs of the expedition were transferred to Berlin and classified as a strategic polar reserve. Some Marine officers insisted during the war that the knowledge acquired in Antarctica should be preserved as a strategic asset of the Reich in the event of a continental collapse. Among them was Admiral Richard E, in a speech to cadets in the city of Kiel, declared in 1943, "The future of the Reich is not only in Europe, but in places that the enemy considers inaccessible." The aerial photographs of Novaban land were sealed under the seal of secret Reich affair. No official document mentioned the Antarctic territory again for the rest of the war. However, at the end of the conflict, when the Nazi archives began to fall into Allied hands, the existence of those images and records reappeared in the intelligence offices. In the midst of the defeat, some US officials began to wonder why the Reich had invested resources, time, and technology in a polar campaign just months before launching the largest war in modern history. and what instated purpose might lie behind that single mission to the most remote continent on the planet. The mysterious finds in Antarctica, warm lakes and hidden bases, the first documents that aroused concern in the Allied powers did not belong to the interwar period, but to the years after the end of the Second World War. In October 1947, the British Admiralty circulated a classified report mentioning the possible presence of previously unmapped thermal anomalies in the Queen War region, consistent with subglacial geothermal activity potentially exploitable for humanly sustainable logistical purposes. The document warned that these areas coincided with regions explored by the Thiegerman expedition of 1938. This was the first official indication that German interest in Antarctica may have served a purpose other than scientific. The suspicion was not born from popular rumors, but from the cross-referencing of scientific reports with information obtained in interrogations of captured senior officers. Among them was a Luftwaffe engineer who said that in the last months of the war, the feasibility of bases in areas where theat of the subsoil prevented the formation of permanent ice sheets had been discussed. At the same time, in the archives seized from the SS Annunera at Witchenfeld, the Allies found incomplete maps of Antarctica with regions marked by symbols used by technical corps of the TOD organization. The name Navenland was accompanied by coordinates that did not match the civilian maps published by the expedition. Scientificist in subglacial lakes was not new. Norwegian geologists during Lars Christensen's expedition in 1937 had reported areas surprisingly free of ice. One of its reports described open water in the middle of the ice, fed by internal heat from the ground, possibly of volcanic origin. However, it was the aerial photographs taken by the Dornierwald seaplanes of the German expedition that provided the first tangible evidence. In them, circular lakes without freezing were observed, surrounded by glaciers. Some pilots reported seeing plumes of steam rising from fissures in the icy surface. Captain Alfred Richer wrote, "The air was warm near the ground. One felt a wet breath that does not belong to this continent." During the war, the expedition's documents were left in the direct custody of the SS, specifically the group led by Hans Kamela, the engineer responsible for the Reich's underground complexes. Kamel was known for his obsession with engineering tunnels, man-made caverns, and geological ventilation systems. He was directly responsible for the construction of the Middle Underground Complex, where V-2 rockets were manufactured. In January 1945, Kamela disappeared along with several trains loaded with technical documents and experimental material. No reliable witnesses could certify his death. The OSS classified it as a top priority, missing with critical information. Kamela's connection to Antarctica was not explicit in any files found, but interrogations of former UNRWA members revealed that Kamela had requested access to Schwaben's maps, according to a March 24, 1945 memorandum recovered by US forces. Kamela reportedly said, "The future is not on the Earth, but under it, where the enemy cannot bomb." In 1948, a British scientific mission led by Sir Hubert Wilkins conducted reconnaissance flights over the eastern sector of Queen Morland. The sensors detected abnormally elevated temperature below the surface at several points. The readings indicated between 5 and 15 C in areas that should be under millennia-old ice sheets. The report noted subglacial heat could support bacterial life and hypothetically geothermally self-sustaining facilities. The Admiralty decided to classify the document with the level highly confidential. At the same time, in 1952, the US Navy partially declassified the X-324 file, which contained correspondence about the CIA and the Naval Intelligence Service. A note dated April 1949 stated, "The German expedition of 1938 identified ice-free regions of as yet undetermined strategic value. There are indications that certain elements of the Reich's technical staff regarded these regions as potential relocation points." The report suggested that some of the material evacuated from Germany before the end of the war may have been transported to the South Atlantic, and that submarines detected in 1945 may have unloaded their contents into unguarded areas of the continent. German scientists captured under Operation Highjump were interrogated regarding installations in polar regions. Some denied the existence of military bases, but confirmed that the Antarctic expedition had found conditions that would allow human settlements with adequate technology. One of them, engineer Wilhelm Exner, stated in 1946, "Kamala showed interesting reports about hot caves, not necessarily for this war, but for a possible future continuity of the Reich." The concept of Base 211 was born in exactly this context. The conjunction of real geological phenomena, proven geothermal activity, and documented disappearance of German technical files, intelligence analysts began to wonder why the original maps of the Schwaben land did not appear among the files confiscated in Berlin. On June 7, 1945, US Colonel Robert C. Thompson issued a report to the Pentagon stating that the original documents of the Reich's Antarctic expedition were not found. There is evidence that they were evacuated before the fall of Berlin, possibly on Kamala's orders. Simultaneously, the Soviet Union published a bulletin in 1949 claiming that the Germans had built experimental dirge infrastructure in remote areas. General Ivan Serov, head of Thankft, wrote in a memo, "Regions of geological heat in Antarctica could have been used for shelters for prolonged war," although the Kremlin never presented concrete evidence. The fact that Soviet intelligence paid attention to the issue made it a matter of strategic interest to the United States. The complexity of the mystery did not lie in direct proof, but in the absence of certainties. During the war, the Thiegerman expedition had been registered as scientific. After the war, key documents from that mission disappeared. Kamala's figure vanished without a trace. The German submarines U-530 and U-977 appeared in Argentina without complete record of their routes. British Admiralty archives detected warm lakes under the Antarctic ice. The US Navy classified reports that pointed to potentially habitable zones. None of these facts alone proved the existence of a German base, but all of them taken together pointed to an enigma that could not be ruled out. Himmler, the SS, and the mystical obsession of the Third Reich. Unlike traditional armies, the SS was not conceived only as a force of combat or repression, but as an ideological order destined to transform the conception of the world. Under the direction of Heinrich Himmler, it acquired a spiritual and almost monastic character, whose objective was not limited to winning the war on the military level, but to redesign the history of humanity, the laws of nature, and the very destiny of the human being. To this end, the Jan Erbe, the Society for the Research and Teaching of the German Ancestral Heritage, was created, an official institution of the Nazi state in charge of studying alleged vestiges of antediluvian civilizations, remains of prehistoric super races, and geographical places associated with the mythical past, of which the German people would be the Directhuer. The Anunner did not operate on the margins, but at the very center of power. It had state funding, direct access to top-notch scientists, and Himmler's personal protection. Its structure brought together archaeologists, ethnologists, geologists, astronomers, anthropologists, and radio communicationists. Their stated mission was to find physical evidence of the existence of a primeval Norse origin for the Aryan race. Expeditions were organized to Iceland, Tibet, Karelia, and the Caucasus, looking for traces of a lost ancestral culture. These missions did not respond to academic logic or conventional scientific methods, but to a worldview in which the past was not only an object of study, but an active source of spiritual power. Himmler was convinced that the planet had been the scene of very ancient civilizations possessing superior energetic knowledge, and that some of these would have survived in inaccessible regions under the Earth or at the poles. According to this view, Antarctica was not a mass of dead ice, but a gateway to forbidden knowledge. The SS regarded the poles as magnetic and spiritual centers of the planet, where unseen forces shaped the climate, energy, and destiny of nations. If that theory were true, control of the South Pole meant not only territorial dominance, but access to thievery source of planetary power. In this conceptual framework, the German expedition to Antarctica in 1938–1939 was not seen simply as just another scientific undertaking, but as an act of spiritual reclamation. The Anamber interpreted the ice-free lakes and geothermal areas, discovered as signs of an ancient energy balance that could be exploited by the Reich. The idea of a polar base did not arise solely from military considerations. It was linked to the notion that Antarctica could be a primordial center, a matrix from which to reconstruct the world according to a new racial order. For Himmler, glaciers had not only strategic minerals, but possibly vestiges of an Aryan Atlantean civilization prior to recorded history. This worldview was incorporated into the official doctrine of the SS through rituals, symbols, and teachings imparted in the castles of spiritual formation such as Vivelelsberg. It taught that the Reich must recover the sacred places of the planet in order to complete its destiny. Antarctica appeared on these mystical maps as one of the last pure territories uncontaminated by modernity or by races considered degenerate by Nazism. It was claimed that the ice concealed structures of non-human origin or vestiges of a vanished superior humanity. These approaches were not marginal, but part of the internal narrative that justified the need for expeditions outside the European continent. Although most German scientists openly rejected esoteric theories, they knew that participating in this research ensured funding and prestige. The regime fused mystical discourses with the rhetoric of technological progress. Geologists sent technical reports on subglacial volcanic activity, while the Anamber interpreted that data as evidence that Antarctica could support hidden settlements. The Nazi state did not distinguish between science and myth, when both could serve the purpose of ideological expansion. Thus, the search for geothermal sources was justified both for their energy value and for their spiritual significance. Hans Kammler, head of the Reich's most secret engineering projects, became a bridge between the mystical vision of the SS and the application of technology. His specialization in underground structures coincided with belief that Antarctica was home to natural caverns heated from the planet's interior. Kammler received reports from the Nunner about possible Antarctic caves shortly before its disappearance in 1945. According to documents recovered by US forces in Bavaria, these caves would have been evaluated as ideal places to build facilities capable of withstanding nuclear bombardments or surviving an eventual collapse of the world order. The ideological connection between Antarctica and the future of the Reich was reinforced by the concept of Globalab's realm. If Germany was to expand beyond Europe, the South Pole represented not only a traditional colony, but the starting point for a new civilization. From there, not only military domination was projected, but a complete restructuring of humanity under a polar worldview. The Anamber considered that the man history was cyclical, and that the next era should begin from the ice. Richard Kammler and other officers were instructed to secure the German presence in that territory for purposes that transcended the immediate present war. At the outbreak of war in 1939, Antarctic surveys were officially suspended, but the documentation was not destroyed. It was classified as a strategic material of the highest priority. In 1943, while Germany was in full retreat from the Eastern Front, Thienener drafted a secret memorandum stating that the final fate of the Reich did not depend on the control of Berlin or Vienna, but on the survival of its idea in places that history has not touched. The reference to the polar regions was later interpreted by the Allies as a possible allusion to Antarctica. During post-war interrogations, captured SS officers did not deny interest in Antarctica, but described it in ambiguous terms. Some related it to mineral resources, others to withdrawal strategies. However, the document seized from the Nunner showed maps marked with symbols that did not correspond to any conventionality. Areas were identified as energy convergence points and strategic visibility zones. Allied analysts concluded that for the SS, the Antarctic territory was not a neutral research site, but an essential component of a worldview that united race, land, and power on the same axis. Himmler's obsession with the South Pole was never publicly addressed during the war. Byrd was embodied in the institutional structure of the Reich. Antarctica figured at the same time as geopolitical and sacred territory. With the military defeat of 1945, that obsession was not extinguished. It turned into suspicion. When the Antarctic documents disappeared from the Reich's official archives, the Allies deduced that they had been deliberately removed to protect information deemed too important to fall into foreign hands. The myth of the Antarctic base was not born of the popular imagination, but of the tangible fact that the records disappeared at the very moment that the Third Reich was dying out in Europe. The connection between mysticism, science, and Nazi technology. The Third Reich did not see science as a neutral discipline, but as an instrument intended to reveal and harness the deepest forces of the universe. Heinrich Himmler promoted the idea that ancient knowledge, modern physics, and the racial destiny of the rich were part of the same axis. This vision led to an unprecedented scientific program which united the most advanced engineering with unorthodox theories. In the Reich's research centers, runic symbols coexisted with electromagnetic resonance equations, and mystical treatises were studied alongside the writings of Maxwell and Tesla. What seemed like superstition to the outside world, to the Nazi scientific structure, was part of an absolute quest to master the hidden forces of nature in order to ensure a millennial hegemony. Within this framework, projects emerged that today are considered the core of the technological myth of Nazism. One of the first was the development of what would become known as Deloa or Lacampan, an experimental device that, according to testimonies collected after the war, would have been tested in underground facialist in Silesia. The name Bell did not refer to a traditional weapon, but a tubular or ovoid-shaped machine surrounded by metal rings and connected to high-voltage cables. The purpose of the apparatus would have been to generate a torsional field by rotating metal elements into radioactive scanning liquid compounds. These experiments would have been linked to theories proposed by physicists such as Walter Gerlach, a pioneer in studies on magnetic separation of particles, and to the work of Otto Schumann on earth field resonance. The research also included the possibility of manipulating gravity using high-frequency vibrations. There was no conclusive evidence that such experiments had achieved practical results, but allied documents mentioned that the scientists involved were real and well-known figures in modern physics. His participation in SS-funded programs demonstrates that the Third Reich was attempting to integrate academic science with theories considered marginal outside Germany. In post-war interrogations, some scientists claimed that the ultimate goal of these experiments was not to create a conventional weapon, but to discover a new state of matter capable of releasing energy directly from the vacuum. The link between advanced physics and mysticism was not anecdotal. For Nazi ideology, the universe was not governed by immutable mechanical laws, but by dynamic forces capable of being dominated by a superior race connected to its spiritual origin. The Anunnerber considered that ancient civilizations had used these forces to build monumental structures and reach vanished technological levels. Himmler believed that the duty of the Reich was to recover that knowledge and restore the lost cosmic balance. To do this, scientists had to investigate not only atoms, but also the invisible energy fields that, according to this worldview, structured reality. The development of V-2 rockets at Peenemünde showed that Germany was willing to push the limits of conventional technology. But even more secretive programs operated under the direction of Hans Kammel, who controlled classified Luftwaffe and SS projects. Kammel coordinated the construction of underground facilities where research on alternative propulsion and field power was conducted. These facilities were not only intended to protect the laboratories from Allied bombing, but to develop a sealed environment isolated from the outside world, where the radiation and temperature conditions necessary for high-energy experiments could be controlled. According to documents declassified by US intelligence in 1952, Kammel had ordered the evacuation of several scientific teams before the fall of the Reich. Some of this equipment was transferred to Austria, others to Norway, and according to some testimonies, a group had been embarked in submarines bound for the South Atlantic. Post-war interrogations cite rumors among SS technicians that torsional field experiments needed a geological environment without electromagnetic disturbances. The concept of Hanabu also emerged within these programs. These were not, according to interrogation documents, spacecraft but theoretical models for creating vehicles with electromagnetic propulsion. The idea was to use the interaction between gravitational fields and torsional fields to produce a levitation effect. Although the plans found did not show an operational design, the SS's interest in this type of technology was real and documented. The connection with Antarctica originated in the need for a territory where the Reich could continue to experiment away from international scrutiny even after an eventual military defeat. The Allies discovered in archives recovered in Bavaria memes mentioning the search for a place beyond enemy air range to move critical technologies. One of them, dated February 1945, referred to regions of permanent ice where the interior heat of the Earth allows shelter. British analysts linked these words to reports from Schwabenlandebut, warm lakes, and subglacial caves. Suspicion that Antarctica was being considered a post-war technological haven began to take shape in intelligence circles. The official science of the Reich was prepared to operate under extreme conditions. The SS had trained special engineering teams to build airtight facilities capable of generating their own power through thermal reactors. Schumann's studies of the Earth's resonance indicated that certain geographical areas could act as natural amplifiers of energy. The interest in these areas was shared by the ANUNR and the Reich's Advanced Armament Section. Antarctica appeared in these documents as a territory with unique characteristics: total isolation, geological stability in certain areas, and scarce cosmic radiation due to the convergence of the Earth's magnetic field. The military defeat of the Reich in Europe did not eliminate these projects. He dispersed them. Some scientists turned themselves into the United States under Operation Paperclip. Others were captured by the Soviet Union. Many disappeared. The Allies discovered that the most sensitive files relating to advanced field physics were not located in Berlin or in the main administrative centers of the Reich. They had been transferred. The US Navy reported in June 1945 that documents associated with the Antarctic expedition and the SS's underground installations were not among the files captured. Analysts deduced that these documents had been deliberately evacuated with the aim of protecting strategic research. The convergence between myth, science, and strategy was consolidated. At that time, the Allies did not know whether the Reich had succeeded in building a base in Antarctica, but they did know that the regime had identified the continent as an ideal environment for experiments. The absence of records was not proof of non-existence, but an indication of concealment. The combination of advanced technologies, electromagnetic research, underground project, and geothermal discoveries transformed Antarctica into a scenario where the possible and the unknown began to overlap for post-war intelligence services. It was in that overlap that the idea was born that the Reich had not ended with the fall of Berlin, but had sought to continue elsewhere. And among all the points on the planet, only one offered absolute silence, energy hidden under the ice, and the promise of a new beginning. The early rivalry between Germany and the United States over Antarctica. The report reached the White House in mid-March 1939. It was brief, signed by the Department of the Navy, and described the recent German expedition to Antarctica in language that did not hide its concern. There was mention of seaplane landings, javelin drops with the swastika, and the proclamation of a new region called Novarben Land, although the German government had declared it to be a scientific mission for the study of whales and meteorology. American analysts did not interpret it as a simple scientific gesture, but as the establishment of a symbolic German presence in the southern hemisphere. Antarctica, until then relegated to academic exploration, entered the strategic map of the United States for the first time. President Franklin D. Roosevelt, deeply attentive to globalbalance, regarded German action as an indication of geographic expansion beyond the European continent. At the beginning of 1939's foreign policy was already revolving around hemispheric projection. The Monroe Doctrine, conceived at the beginning of the 19th century to prevent European intervention in America, was now beginning to be interpreted as a principle applicable to the South Atlantic as well. If the Reich succeeded in consolidating a presence, however symbolic, in Antarctica, it would mean a direct challenge to US dominance in the southern region of the planet. In this context, the American Antarctic expedition was organized between 1939 and 1941. Led by Admiral Richard E. Byrd. Officially, it was a scientific mission with support from the Smithsonian Institution and the United States Navy. However, internal State Department documents revealed that its true purpose was strategic: to evaluate the possibility of establishing permanent bases, to identify territories suitable for claims, and to study whether the Antarctica could host naval installations. The expedition was authorized as a matter of urgency. 3 ships, the USBEAR, the USS City of New York, and the icebreaker USS North Star, set sail with scientific and military personnel. Byrd received confidential instructions. He was to map the eastern part of the continent and determine whether the Germans had left permanent marks. On January 14, 1940, US planes flew over the sector that the Germans had named Navabenland. One of the observers, Lieutenant James Sherald, recorded in his diary that they had identified rectilinear marks on the ice, possibly left by recent foreign expeditions. These observations were not published, but they confirmed that the United States considered the German presence a plausible threat. In one of the telegrams sent to Washington, Byrd said that the continent could become the last great theater of territorial dispute in the next 100 years. Meanwhile, Germany intensified Antarctic interest from the rear. Following the 1938 to 1939 expedition, reconnaissance units were created within the Marine dedicated to studying routes to the South Atlantic. German weather stations in the North Atlantic were extended to the edge of the polar circle. Secret reports from the US Navy detected encrypted transmissions from southern latitudes. Although the exact location was never identified, it was suspected that one of the Type 9 submarines had operated in the vicinity of the Antarctic continent for the United States. The possibility of Germany using Antarctica as a stopover point for submarines was an unacceptable prospect. With the outbreak of World War II in September 1939, Antarctic competition began to intensify geopolitically. Roosevelt ordered that any German attempt to claim territory outside Europe was to be neutralized pillicum or, if necessary, by physical presence. In December of that same year, naval advisor William D. Stahn wrote a memorandum in which he warned, "The Southern Hemisphere will be the next arena of ideological containment." Germany is not only looking for territories, it is looking for strategies that challenge American naval supremacy. Tension increased after the collapse of France in 1940. The United States feared that Germany, already controlling much of Western Europe, would expand its radius of action into the Atlantic. FB reports mentioned suspicious movements by German agents in Chile, Argentina, and Patagonia, although not made public. There were talks between the Navy and the State Department in which the possibility of establishing a strategic exclusion zone around Antarctica was discussed. This was not a public statement, but a directive to monitor any attempt at foreign occupation of the White Continent. At the same time, the German press began to spread articles on the future importance of the polar territories. Although most focused on the Arctic, some vaguely mentioned the natural connection between the German people and the peoples of the South. An internal bulletin of the Nazi Party seized after the war mentioned that the southern regions represent the door to the definitive supremacy of the Reich. This was not disclosed, but it confirmed to American analysts that Antarctica was being contemplated within the German global doctrine. Byrd's 1939 expedition established 2 US bases, West Base and East Base, both in the eastern side of the continent. These facilities, although presented as scientific laboratories, were equipped with long-range radios, dual-use weather stations, and improvised runways for military aircraft. Byrd sent a coded report to Washington stating that the continent was of incalculable strategic value and recommended a permanent presence. The report also noted that while no permanent German facilities were found, there were areas where ice showed recent topographical alterations that could indicate previous human activity. The United States wasn't alone in its concern. In 1941, before its formal entry into the war, Britain began covert operations in the South Atlantic. The Royal Navy deployed secret stations on the sub-Antarctic islands and launched Operation Tabarin, officially scientific, but aimed at countering German influence. British reports indicated that ships flying the German commercial flag had been seen sailing near the South Orne Islands. The fear was not an immediate military invasion, but a symbolic presence that could be used after the conflict to reclaim strategic territories. The rivalry between Germany and the United States over Antarctica did not erupt into open confrontation during the war. It developed as a silent competition in which each power sought to establish presence proofs, collect geological data and safeguard documents. The German mission had marked the beginning. Byrd's expedition was the answer. Both knew that apart from the active war in Europe, a new front was opening up, one where there were no trenches or cities, but ice, unexplored resources, and absolute silence. In December 1941, following the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, the United States entered the war. Antarctica was momentarily out of public spotlight, but it did not disappear from the strategic archives. The Navy filed Byrd's data under Thepler priority classification. The Reich, for its part, redirected its resources to the Eastern Front, but did not disband the Antarctic section of the Marine. From that moment on, the dispute over the White Continent would enter a hidden phase marked by submarine movements, coded transmissions, and memoranda that pointed out that the true value of Antarctica had not yet been revealed. The collapse of the Reich and the flight of its scientific and military elites. In April 1945, as Berlin was being reduced to ruins, the Third Reich began to dissolve, not as a surrendering structure, but as a deliberately fragmenting organization. Documents recovered after the war showed that in recent months, the Reich Chancellery had issued more than 20 secret evacuation orders targeting scientific, technical, and naval units. The fronts were collapsing, but the archives and knowledge kept moving. The chaos of defeat was also an operation of concealment. Among the most enigmatic figures of that end was SS General Hans Kamila. An engineer by training, he oversaw the Reich's most advanced technology programs, the weapons, the experimental energy projects, and the underground laboratories of Silesia. On April 17, 1945, Kamila left Berlin with a convoy of 3 trucks and an armored train. On board, he carried sealed metal containers and documents marked with the Geheime Reich Saga seal. He was never seen with certainty again. For the OSS, its disappearance was one of the greatest enigmas of the post-war period. It was assumed that he had died, but no body was identified. The Soviets claimed to have captured him. The Americans denied it. The truth is the files he controlled did not reappear either. In those same days, Admiral Karl Dönitz, Hitler's designated successor, was transmitting coded orders to the submarine fleets of the Atlantic. From his base in Flensburg, he instructed the commanders of Type 9 and 21 submarines to keep in minimal communication and proceed according to advance instructions. No subsequent document clarified what those instructions meant. What is known is that between April and May 1945, several German submarines set sail from Norway and northern Germany to the Atlantic with no declared destination. Many surrendered in European ports, others simply disappeared. Allied intelligence recorded an anomalous pattern. Between 10 and 20 May, British and American stations intercepted German naval code transmissions from the South Atlantic. They were brief, low-frequency signals that repeated coordinates and weather codes. Analysts deduced that they came from moving submarines. At least a dozen messages were picked up before they ceased completely. None coincided with known fleets or surrendered units. In the Tyrol region, the Allies found documents mentioning the evacuation of priority scientific material. Among the lists were names of physicists and technicians linked to advanced energy projects, as well as engineers associated with Camilla, somewhere later located in Bavaria or Austria. Others never appeared. Unidentified flights were recorded taking off from Prague and makeshift airfields in northern Germany during the final weeks of the war. Luftwaffe files indicated destinations to Norway, but arrival records were incomplete. When Berlin fell on the 2nd of May, Donit's new provisional government based in Flensburg was still trying to negotiate surrender. However, the Marine continued to operate. The submarines EU-530 and U-977 were reported on mission until June. Both emerged weeks later on the coast of Mar del Plata, Argentina. Its commanders claimed to have escaped to avoid capture, but declined to specify their route. Argentine Admiralty interrogation reports noted that the crews destroyed all navigational logs before surrendering. The United States sent naval agents to interrogate them. The answers were evasive. No evidence of contraband or cargo was found, but the silence of the sailors fueled the suspicion that they had landed something or someone at another point before surrendering. At the same time, the Allied services were investigating a clandestine escape network known as Odessa, tasked with transporting former party officials and scientists to South America. Declassified documents decades later reveal that between 1945 and 1947, hundreds of members of the Nazi apparatus managed to reach Argentina, Chile, and Paraguay with the help of church and business organizations. However, a smaller group made up of engineers, drivers, and technical officials disappeared completely from the records. Some US analysts linked those disappearances to evacuationers issued by Camilla and Donuts. In parallel, the Soviets conducted thorough investigations. The NKVD recovered in Poland a set of plans for underground facialists that, according to its engineers, could be adapted for use in polar regions. The documents were immediately classified. Moscow suspected that Germany had built underground shelters in Norway or farther south, and ordered its naval units to monitor the Atlantic. In its reports, the possibility of escape zones to southern latitudes is mentioned. The CIA created shortly thereafter, inherited those reports and re-examined them in the context of the Cold War. The notion that the Reich had planned its survival beyond Europe gained strength between 1946 and 1947. The US intelligence services cross-referenced data on Allied reconnaissance flights with movements of German ships that did not surrender. In one such report, dated July 20 to end, 1946, it is concluded that a substantial part of the German scientific apparatus may have been evacuated before the collapse of the Reich. The document does not mention Antarctica directly, but notes that the South Atlantic remains a blind spot for Allied control. The reference fueled speculation for decades. The testimonies of Allied sailors added more uncertainty. In June 1945, a British destroyer reported detecting a submarine deep under South Georgia. When they tried to make contact, the object disappeared from radar. Days later, a US reconnaissance plane spotted a submerged wake moving south. No remains were recovered and the boat was not identified. The report was filed under the category No Tactical Relevance, but reopened years later when reports about secret German bases began circulating. As the Reich disintegrated, so did the evidence of its plans. Many files were burned in the courtyards of the ministries, others packaged and transported westward on trains with no destination. The Allies occupied empty factories, closed tunnels, and sealed bunkers. In some they found unknown machinery, all parts covered in radioactive waste, and electrical generators of experimental design. No technical document accompanied the installations. OSS engineers concluded that the filing systems and prototypes were intentionally removed prior to the arrival of troops. The collapse of the Reich was not only political or military, it was a strategic withdrawal of knowledge. Germany understood before anyone else that modern warfare would be decided by science. When that war was lost, knowledge had to survive. The territories and capitals no longer mattered. The essential thing was to preserve men, plans, and ideas. So, While Soviet troops raised their flag over the Reich, flagless ships crossed the Atlantic, planes disappeared en route north and south, and names of German scientists were erased from prisoner lists. By the end of 1945, the Allies acknowledged that they did not know precisely how many German submarines were still operational. Some estimates spoke of 20 missing ships. The US Navy called the situation a post-Schirnder anomaly. The Soviets claimed that the submarines had sunk. The Americans did not rule it out, but they did not believe it either. The last report of unidentified activity in the South Atlantic was dated 9 August 1945. Then silenced the secret projects digerned the weapons of advanced technology. When the Third Reich understood that conventional warfare was lost, it did not abandon the struggle in the field of science. In early 1944, the Reich Armaments Office transferred its most secret projects to underground facilities in Silesia, Austria, and Thessaloniki. They were protected complexes under mountains and salt mines with sealed tunnels and armored laboratories. The most important physicists, engineers, and specialists of the Reich operated there under the strict supervision of a man whose figure grew to become a dominant shadow over the last days of the regime. Hans Kammler, with direct power granted by Heinrich Himmler and Hitler. Kammler directed all advanced weapons programs, from V-torkets to prototypes of unconventional aircraft. One such project was Senna-Medulla, the Bell. Post-war interrogations, especially SS General Jakob Sparrenbergstein to Polish authorities in 1950, described DLCA as an ovoid-shaped metal device surrounded by a framework with concentric rings. It was said to contain 2 rotating cylinders filled with an extremely dense liquid compound labeled Zerum 525. The technicians involved were forced to sign confidentiality oaths under penalty of death. The exact goal of the project was never officially stated, but testimonies agreed that it sought to generate a rotating electromagnetic, possibly for research into anti-gravity or the release of energy from the quantum vacuum. The participation of renowned scientists such as Walter Gerlach, a pioneer in quantum magnetism studies, and Otto Schumann, an expert in Earth resonance, confirmed that the project was not a fringe fantasy, but a real state-funded scientific program. Documents seized by the Red Army in 1945 revealed calculations on resonant cavities, Schumann frequency, and field matter coupling. The OSS report of July 1946 noted that the German government was exploring radical theories about the control of the gravitational field and the use of torsional radiation for propulsion purposes. The Glocker device was not the Reich's only advanced experiment. In parallel, there were programs such as Hannibal and Vril-Wick referred, according to Allied sources, to studies on aircraft with electromagnetic propulsion. There is no evidence that these projects reached the functional prototype stage, but Ministry of Aviation files show that resources were reallocated to develop aircraft without traditional airfoils. The laboratories of the Midburg complex, where the V-2 rockets were manufactured, contained designs for circular craft that would have used plasma engines or rotary field generators as a source of impulse. The Reich's interest in these technologies was not merely theoretical. Adolf Hitler and his circle believed that war should be won not by quantity, but by the discovery of a superior physical principle that would allow the limits of conventional aviation and ballistics to be overcome. The rocket program led by Vera von Braun was a tangible example of this vision. But Kammler's projects went further. They sought a technological eventual capable of altering the global balance of power. The Allies discovered in tunnels in the Sudetenland parts of electric generators that did not correspond to any known technology, lead and thorium coatings, and test benches capable of generating pulses of high radiation. When he evacuated Berlin in April 1945, Kammler would have personally supervised the transfer of Glocker from the Vences facility in Silesia to an unknown location. Witnesses said 2 scientists were executed on the spot for talking about the project. Sparrenberg himself stated that the Bell was transported on a Junkers Ju-390 cargo plane heading north or south. No official record confirmed the destination, nor were any remains of the aircraft found in Europe after the war. The Soviets captured part of the test complex and took several engineers from Gerlich's team. Soviet scientific groups worked for a decade trying to replicate the experiments described in the German documents. The United States, meanwhile, obtained plans of underground laboratories that mentioned rotational energy fields and structures designed to withstand exposure to intense radiation. The US concluded that the Reich was on the verge of achieving a significant discovery in the field of applied electromagnetism. After the war, the US Navy issued a report on underground facilities in the Reich, in which it was noted that the most advanced technologies were not found in the expected locations. Many facilities were empty or destroyed. The most important plans had disappeared. The scientists most committed to Takamila's projects were not among the prisoners. Everything indicated that there was no disorderly collapse, but planned extraction. Some CIA investigators suggested that some of these programs may have been moved out of the European theater shortly before the surrender. The connection to Antarctica arose from a minor detail included in a 1948 British report. The document referred to a memorandum from the Reich Ministry of Armaments, found in a salt mine in South Germany, which mentioned the establishment of laboratories in safe southern territories for the development of the special program. It was not specified whether these territories were South American or Antarctic. However, the word Australs caught the attention of US analysts as it matched the network of submarines that had operated in the South Atlantic during the final months of the war. In late 1946, the secret X-07 report of US Naval Intelligence recorded a note mentioning a possible transfer of field program material into a region office where there are no observers. The exact sentence read, "It is considered possible that the Reich has attempted to secure on Antarctic territory a refuge for the development of new weapons based on non-aerodynamic phenomena. No conclusive evidence is available." It was the first time that a NALI document directly linked the Reich's experiments with a possible projection towards the White Continent. The report was immediately filed under maximum classification. Operation Highjump, 1946 to 1947. The American fleet towed ice. On August 26, 1946, a classified memorandum of the United States Joint Chiefs of Staff, identified as JCS-1385, authorized the largest peacetime naval operation ever recorded. The order mentioned the establishment of the US presence on the Antarctic continent for the purposes of training, research, and geopolitical consolidation. The administrative language concealed the true nature of the mission. Among its real objectives were the study of conditions for air operations in polar regions, the evaluation of the enemy's potential in southern territories, and the investigation of possible installations hidden under the ice. The document noted that the mission had to be completed quickly before the Soviet Union could react. The operation was Cenomed Highjump and put in command Admiral Richard E. Byrd, America's most celebrated polar explorer. A veteran of previous expeditions, Byrd understood that this time he was not leading a scientific mission, but a covert military operation under Thegas of research. Its fleet included 13 ships, including the aircraft carrier US Philippine Sea, destroyers USS Brownson and USS Henderson, icebreaker USS Burton Island, submarine USS Senate, and support ships equipped with helicopters, PBM Mariner bombers, and F-4U Corsair fitters. More than 4,000 men were part of the contingent. It was a sufficient force to invade a small country, their destination, Antarctica. On the December 2, 1946, Task Force 68 left Norfolk Harbor, Virginia. While the press announced that the United States was preparing to study the polar climate and train its troops, military analysts pointed out that the deployment was unprecedented for a scientific fiction. The Pentagon had authorized rules of engagement in the event of unidentified hostile contact, a Klausnever before used in climate research missions. Admiral Byrd carried specific orders to conduct intensive aerial reconnaissance, establish temporary bases on the ice, and map regions never before seen by Allied forces. The official objective was to investigate the feasibility of future bases in Antarctica for strategic air operations. The unstated objective was to confirm whether there was a foreign presence, either German or Soviet, on the continent. Naval documents from the time mention legitimate concerns about German movements prior to 1945 and the possibility that remnants of the Reich's scientific apparatus had been evacuated. The presence of US submarines and the inclusion of significant weaponry in the expedition showed that the government did not rule out encountering Crescent. The fleet arrived in the Antarctic sector at the beginning of January 1947. The extreme weather turned every maneuver into a risky operation. The planes took off from the deck of the aircraft carrier Philippine Sea on reconnaissance missions. They flew over vast expanses of ice, recording topographic anomalies and areas of exposed terrain. One of the pilots recorded in the flight log described areas where ice opens, revealing liquid water and bare rock. Some internal reports mentioned thermal fumes and constant fog not caused by normal atmospheric conditions. Maps preceding those weeks showed regions without glacier cover that did not match observations made during Byrd's expedition in 1939. On January 30th, a PBM Mariner aircraft disappeared during a reconnaissance flight. Officials reported an explosion in the air, but the final report was immediately classified. 3 days later, another plane had to make an emergency landing for unidentified reasons. The crew claimed to have been attacked by an unnatural gust of wind that altered the instruments. The official report attributed it to thunderstorms, but weather conditions showed no unusual activity. Byrd requested authorization to suspend flights in certain areas due to presence of unknown phenomena. The United States was not the only power watching. The US called Highjump an active militarization of the White Continent and sent diplomatic protests. Britain, which had already established Operation Tabarin in the South Atlantic, sent confidential reports recommending to monitor with extreme attention the American activities in the Antarctic sector. On February 12, one of the US ships detected low-frequency radio signals that did not match Soviet or British transmissions. The operators unable to establish contact. The signals ceased 2 days later. The sudden withdrawal of Operation Highjump and Byrd statements. On March 3 1947, less than 8 weeks after its arrival on the Antarctic continent, the US fleet of Operation Highjump received an unexpected order to cease all activities and undertake the immediate return home. There was no prior warning or official explanation. Communications from the Pentagon used logistical regrouping language, but personnel on board interpreted the withdrawal as an emergency maneuver. Some teams were not even able to recover their instruments. Reconnaissance planes were abandoned on the ice. Byrd did not dispute the order, he simply executed it. The ships began to sail north in the midst of absolute secrecy. Unlike the outward trip, there was no communication with the press or statements about scientific advancement. Only coded shipments addressed to the Joint Chiefs of Staff were recorded. During the crossing, medical officers reported cases of extreme exhaustion among air crews, accompanied by episodes of anxiety and stress reactions to unidentified phenomena during reconnaissance operations. No part of it was publicly disclosed. When the fleet arrived at the port of Valparaiso, Chile, Admiral Byrd agreed to give a brief interview to local journalists before departing for the United States. The conversation lasted less than 10 minutes, but he left a sentence that baffled those present and set off alarms in Washington. It is imperative that the United States adopt measures of defense against the possibility that a new form of aircraft capable of flying from pole to pole at incredible speeds could threaten any nation. The transcript appeared the next day in the newspaper El Mercurio. Hours later, the US ambassador submitted a diplomatic note requesting that the fragment be removed from the press. The newspaper was instructed to remove the interview from future editions. Byrd was flown from Chile directly to the Norfolk Naval Base, and then to Washington, D.C. for questioning before the Committee of National Defense. The sessions were held behind closed doors. No public minutes were recorded. According to documents declassified in 1994, the topics covered included unidentified aerial contacts, electromagnetic disturbances observed near the ice shelf, and atmospheric phenomena incompatible with traditional storms. although the Pentagon never released details. The session concluded with the classification of all Task Force 68 flight reports as top secret. The following months were marked by the contradiction between the official narrative and the strategic perception. The Navy Department said in statements that the operation had been a scientific success focused on preparing personnel for extreme conditions. However, military circles were debating the sudden cancellation of a mission that, according to its original plan, was to last for 8 months. Analysts concluded that the withdrawal was not due to weather conditions or logistical failures, but to unforeseen factors that altered the main objective of the operation. The reaction in the Soviet Union was immediate. In May 1947, then's paper Pravda published an article entitled "American Imperialism in Antarctica," accusing the United States of attempting to establish military bases near the southern hemisphere under the pretext of science. The note stated that the abrupt withdrawal showed that the United States encountered resistance of an unknown kind. Although the US government denied that claim, the comment did not disappear from internal Pentagon reports. At the same time, the State Department received reports from embassies in South America about rumors circulating between Chilean and Argentine naval officers. Some spoke of objects emerging from the water during US patrols. Others mentioned explosions with no visible source recorded by the ships in the first weeks of the operation. None of these reports could be verified, but they were shelved because they coincided on one point. American air operations had detected something unexpected over the White Continent. The US government, aware of the risk involved in any leak of information related to unknown phenomena, decided to establish a protocol to silence statements by personnel participating in the operation. Several officers were reassigned to remote bases and forced to sign confidentiality agreements. Richard Byrd was temporarily removed from active duty and sent to his residence in Virginia. Officially, it was explained that he was suffering from exhaustion. Unofficially, he had been removed from the public spotlight. Most significant occurred in June 1947, when the Committee on Homeland Security issued a confidential memorandum warning that information collected in the Southern Hemisphere requires the continuation of strategic investigations under special protocols. The document indicated that it should preserve the advantage obtained and prevent other powers from discovering the nature of the phenomena observed. The term used to refer to these phenomena was not enemy or rival but unidentified potential. The United States did not publicly declare the existence of such a threat. He did not communicate to the world that Antarctica was not an empty territory. He didn't announce that he had found something he didn't expect. But the language of the Pentagon memos changed irreversibly. References to the regencies to belong to the Department of International Cooperation and were transferred directly to the Joint Intelligence Committee. Antarctica had ceased to be a stage of exploration to become a strategic front whose true nature could not be revealed. Operation Highjump officially concluded on June 24, 1947. That same week, the Joint Chiefs of Staff issued a new order. All information related to military activities in Southern territories is under permanent classification. No further communication shall be authorized without approval from the Joint Committee on Intelligence. While this was happening in Argentina, Chile and Uruguay, lights were reported over the sea and objects emerging from the water. In September 1947, fishermen in Patagonia reported seeing metallicircles flying over the Beagle Channel before disappearing southwards. The navies of these countries carried out patrols without results, but the reports were shared with the US Embassy, which forwarded them directly to the Joint Intelligence Committee in Washington. Post-war documents also revealed that during Operation Highjump, a number of aircraft had recorded magnetic disturbances and sightings not included in scientific reports. A pilot of FB-32 Squadron, according to a Navy report of May 2, 1947, described a bright formation moving in an east-west direction over the edge of the ice. When they tried to follow it, the aircraft began to lose altitude with no apparent mechanical cause. This type of incident was concealed by technical reports that attributed the failures to geomagnetic storms. In November 1947, the Pentagon held a closed session at which a document classified under the code FZ-47 was distributed. The text stated, "The accumulation of unidentified aerial reports, especially in the North and South Polar Hemispheres, indicates the possible existence of a systemic phenomenon. The hypothesis of unknown technology controlled by undeclared agents is not ruled out." Although the document did not mention Germany or Antarctica directly, several annexes referred to reports related to Task Force 68. Richard Byrd was recalled to Washington in late 1947. Its final report was incorporated into the Project Sign file. According to an internal memo from Colonel Howard McCoy, Byrd stated that some of the phenomena observed in Antarctica appear to respond to intelligent patterns of movement. He wasn't allowed to continue. The session ended abruptly. The report was sealed with the top secret restricted data classification. On December 30, 1947, the Committee on National Security issued a directive with the headline that marked a turning point in American military history. From this date on, all activity related to unidentified aerial phenomena shall be analyzed under protocols of extreme threat to continental security. A direct relationship is established between these phenomena and possible hidden installations outside the American continent. From this cover-up, one of the longest-lived mysteries in contemporary history was born, and which is, as its main setting, one of the most inhospitable and hostile places on the planet. What really happened in Antarctica? The alleged hidden war and the echoes of the UFO phenomenon. On June 24, 1947, just days after Operation Highjump was officially shut down and its files placed under classification, an American civilian pilot named Kenneth Arnold was flying over Mount Rainier in Washington state. From the cockpit of his Call Air 2, he observed 9 metal objects moving at enormous speed in formation. Arnold described his movement as saucers bouncing on water. The phrase would be misinterpreted as the shape of the object, giving rise to the term flying saucer. What most concerned the Air Force was not the public description, but the estimated speed, more than 1,600 km, a figure impossible for any known aircraft. The sighting was not ruled out. He was classified. Less than 12 weeks later, on July 8, a press release from Roswell Air Force Base, New Mexico, announced that a flying disc had been recovered from a nearby ranch. Hours later, the statement was retracted and replaced by another that claimed it was a weather balloon, but the damage was done. The news traveled the world, and what seemed like an isolated event began to take on strategic dimensions. US intelligence services detected that since March of that same year, similar incidents had been recorded at air bases in the southern hemisphere, including Byrd Island, the Kerguelen Archipelago, and the coast of Queen Morland in Antarctica. The temporal pattern was evident to certain military analysts. Early reports of unidentified objects began to intensify immediately after Highjump's abrupt retreat. An internal report dated July 10, 1947, and signed by Naval Intelligence noted, "Unidentified aerial activity has been recorded in the southern hemisphere with unusual frequency. It is recommended to correlate these reports with data collected during the recent polar operation." The correlation was never made public. It was archived under the directives of the Joint Intelligence Committee. Statements from Task Force 68 pilots, kept secret for years, described lights rising straight upward from the frozen skyline and objects gliding silently before vanishing with sudden, extreme acceleration. These observations were never added to the official meteorological summaries, but they were documented in personal flight journals that were seized once the fleet reached Norfolk. Richard Byrd, during his questioning at the Pentagon, allegedly spoke of devices able to traverse the Earth's curvature in remarkably short periods. Though no public record of that comment exists. At the same time, the Soviet Union began logging strange phenomena in the Arctic. Soviet radio technicians on the Kola Peninsula detected electromagnetic anomalies resembling those picked up by the American task force in Antarctica. In an August 1947 briefing to the Kremlin, Rear Admiral Ivan Yumev wrote, "If the Americans discovered something in the south, we must consider that it is either not of earthly origin or stems from technologies developed by Reich elements that escaped to remote regions. The USSR did not dismiss the possibility of relocated German research. Neither did the United States. Tensions escalated when, on July 23, 1947, the U.S. Air Force tracked an unidentified craft above the San Diego Naval Base heading toward the South Pacific. Radar personnel reported that the object climbed beyond 25,000 meters with instantaneous speed changes. Naval analysts suggested it might involve advanced foreign engineering. In this atmosphere, Project signed the first formal American program to investigate unidentified aerial phenomena was formed. Its establishing memorandum stated that the objects being reported represented a new category of aircraft and could pose a national security concern. The Project Sign archives contained direct mentions of the Southern Hemisphere. One internal memorandum stated that there exists a chance that some of these craft originated from concealed sites beyond the coverage of continental radar networks. Another copy sent to Naval Intelligence added, "The sighting patterns align with maritime routes leading toward sub-Antarctic zones." This marked the earliest instance in which unknown aerial activity was officially associated by the security establishment with regions surrounding Antarctica.